Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. You know we love to pull back the curtain on the complex systems that we interact with every day. And today we're diving into something super relevant, especially to anyone who takes medication or has had a medical procedure.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about the behind-the-scenes processes that guarantee the quality and safety of literally every pill you swallow and every medical device used in a hospital.
It's equipment qualification, or EQ for short, and it's a critical but often overlooked aspect of pharmaceutical and medical device manufacturing.
Yeah, people often don't realize the incredible amount of work and scrutiny that goes into making sure these machines are doing their job correctly day in and day out.
So today we're going to unpack EQ, break it down into understandable chunks, and highlight why it matters so much to each and every one of us.
We'll be diving deep into the four key stages of this process: design qualification, or DQ, installation qualification, or IQ, operational qualification, or OQ, and finally, performance qualification, or PQ.
It sounds a bit jargony, I know, but we'll make sure it all makes sense by the end.
These stages aren't just suggestions, by the way. Regulatory bodies like the FDA in the US, the EMA in Europe, the MHRA in the UK, and the World Health Organization all mandate these processes to ensure patient safety and product efficacy globally.
All right, and just imagine for a second if these processes were neglected. We could be dealing with medications that are ineffective or worse, medical devices that malfunction during critical procedures.
And the consequences can be huge. Compromised product quality can mean production delays, skyrocketing costs for manufacturers, warning letters from those regulatory bodies, and even product recalls.
And all of that ultimately trickles down to, you guessed it, patient safety.
Mhm.
We don't want to be taking medications that aren't pure or relying on a medical device that might fail when we need it most.
And that's exactly why robust EQ is so important. It's the bedrock of dependability and safety within these industries, and it all starts at the very beginning with design qualification, or DQ.
So let's start there. What exactly is design qualification and why is it considered so foundational in this whole process?
Well, you can think of DQ as making sure the blueprints for the equipment are top-notch before a single screw is turned.
So before any metal is cut or code is written, they're meticulously scrutinizing the plans.
Exactly. It's about proving, with solid documentation, that the design meets all the user needs, the functional requirements, and those ever-important regulatory standards, especially good manufacturing practices, or GMP.
So how does this process actually play out? What are the steps involved in making sure the design is up to snuff?
Okay, so it usually starts with something called the User Requirement Specification, or URS. The company that will use the equipment outlines precisely what they need the equipment to do, like every detail, operating conditions, how it should perform, everything.
So kind of like a super detailed wish list for the perfect piece of equipment.
Yeah, exactly. And then they have to find someone who can build it. So they evaluate potential suppliers, looking for the best fit for their needs.
And then I'm guessing they dive deep into the proposed design itself.
Right. They go over everything: materials, dimensions, control systems, safety features, you name it, especially the software running the whole thing.
And just to be extra careful, I'm assuming there's a comprehensive risk assessment at this point, right?
Absolutely. They're looking for any potential weaknesses or risks to product quality or safety, while it's still relatively easy to make changes.
And if the design passes all these checks, it gets a thumbs up and we move on.
Right. It gets formal approval, and then, and only then, can the actual construction begin.
You mentioned URS and also design specification or DS. What's the key difference between those two documents?
Good question. The URS, as we said, is like the what's and the why. It defines what the equipment is supposed to do, its environment, how it will be used, and all the safety and regulatory boxes it has to tick.
It's basically the guiding document for the whole project, making sure everyone stays on the same page.
Exactly. The DS, on the other hand, is more about the how. It's a technical blueprint, laying out how the equipment will be built to meet those URS requirements. Sometimes there's also an FS, a functional specification, bridging the gap between the two.
So URS is the dream, FS is the plan to achieve that dream, and DS is the detailed blueprint for the engineers to follow.
Perfect analogy.
Now, we know the FDA and other regulatory bodies are pretty strict. Do they have specific things they look for during this design phase?
Oh, absolutely. For pharmaceuticals, there's 21 CFR Part 211.63, which specifically states that equipment must be appropriately designed. and you can find that on ecfr.gov.
So that's the FDA saying, hey, the design better be good because it's the foundation for everything that follows.
Exactly. For medical devices, 21 CFR Part 820, Subpart C, Section 820.30 outlines those design control requirements. And while there isn't a dedicated FDA guideline specifically for DQ, their guidance on process validation and quality systems, which you can find on fda.gov, consistently stresses the importance of a thorough design phase.
So tons of emphasis on getting that design right. It makes sense. If you start with a shaky foundation, the whole thing could crumble. Now, with all this scrutiny, I imagine there's a mountain of documentation generated during design qualification.
You bet. You've got the URS, of course, laying out all those user needs. Then you've got an impact assessment, which analyzes how the equipment might affect product quality.
So they're preemptively thinking about potential problems.
Exactly. And then you've got the risk analysis report, which dives deep into design-related risks.
They're not taking any chances, leaving no stone unturned at this stage.
Right. And there's also a traceability matrix, which connects every single requirement in the URS to a specific aspect of the design. It's all about showing that every user need has been addressed.
So if an auditor comes knocking, they can easily follow the paper trail and see that everything's been considered.
Exactly. And of course, you have qualification plans and reports outlining the whole DQ strategy and findings, deviation reports for any hiccups along the way, and a final comprehensive DQ report summarizing the whole thing and concluding whether the design is fit for purpose.
So it's a meticulous paper trail, ensuring every I is dotted and every T is crossed before they move on to the next stage. Okay, so we've got a fantastic design, all documented and approved. What happens next in the equipment qualification process?
Next up is installation qualification, or IQ. Now we're moving from the theoretical to the physical. It's all about making sure the equipment is installed correctly.
So we've got the perfect blueprint, and now we're making sure it's actually built and set up according to those plans.
Exactly. The main goals of IQ are to prove, again with detailed documentation, that the equipment was delivered as expected, installed according to the design and the manufacturer's instructions, and that all the necessary components, utilities, everything is hooked up and ready to go.
So it's not just plugging it into the wall and hoping for the best. Walk us through what a typical IQ process actually looks like.
Okay, so first, there's a lot of prep work. Defining the scope of the IQ, identifying the critical parts of the installation that need to be checked, and even a risk assessment specifically for the installation process itself.
So a risk assessment for installing the equipment.
Yeah. Are there any special handling requirements, potential dangers during setup, things like that?
Wow, they really are thinking of every possible thing that could go wrong.
Right. And then they create a detailed IQ protocol, a step-by-step guide for the entire process, outlining all the tests, inspections, acceptance criteria, and what documentation to keep.
It sounds incredibly thorough.
Oh, it is. And then qualified personnel execute that protocol. They do all the tests, make sure everything's installed correctly, verify calibrations of any instruments used during installation, and ensure the control systems are working as they should.
And I'm assuming documentation is still king at this stage.
Absolutely. Every single data point, every observation, any little deviation, it all gets recorded. Then they put together a comprehensive IQ report, summarizing everything and giving a final verdict, pass or fail.
So give us some examples of what they're actually checking during this IQ. What are they looking for on those checklists?
Well, they start by making sure the delivered equipment matches the purchase order and packing list. No surprises there.
Makes sense.
Then they check that the equipment specifications align with the design and operational needs.
So double checking those specs.
Exactly. They also make sure it's in the right spot and that all the utility connections like electricity, water, air, whatever it needs, are all correctly hooked up and functioning.
So they're not just making sure it's plugged in, but that the right voltage, the right kind of water, everything is perfect.
All right, all the supporting equipment, software, firmware, everything gets checked. And then they make sure they have all the manuals, certifications, calibration records for any tools used. Plus, they give the equipment a thorough look over for any damage that might have happened during shipping.
They're being super meticulous here, leaving nothing to chance.
And finally, they might even check things like the temperature and humidity at the installation site, just making sure the environment is right for the equipment.
It's amazing how much detail goes into this. So what about our regulatory friends? Do they have specific rules about installation?
Of course. For pharmaceuticals, there's 21 CFR Part 211.63. This says the equipment must be suitably located for operations, cleaning, and maintenance. You can find that on ecfr.gov.
So proper installation is key.
Exactly. For medical devices, it's 21 CFR Part 820.70G, which states that equipment must be designed, constructed, placed, and installed in a way that makes maintenance, adjustment, cleaning, and use easy.
It sounds like they really want to make sure everything is accessible and well organized.
Right. The FDA's guidance on process validation, found on fda.gov, reinforces this by emphasizing that IQ is a fundamental part of any validated process. And their inspection guides also often highlight the need for verified installation.
So no cutting corners here. You mentioned the IQ protocol earlier. What are some best practices when writing one of those?
A good IQ protocol is super important. Risk management plays a key role as it helps prioritize what to focus on.
So identifying potential problems before they arise.
Exactly. Using historical data from past IQs on similar equipment can be a huge help.
Learning from experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's crucial to define clear, measurable acceptance criteria. No vague language.
So being super specific about what passes and what fails.
Right. You should also cross-reference it with the validation master plan and the DQ documentation just to make sure everything is aligned.
Consistency is key.
Yeah. And the protocol should also include a process for dealing with any nonconformities found during installation.
So a plan of action for any unexpected issues.
Right. And be proactive. Think about future modifications or upgrades and how to make the protocol flexible enough to accommodate those.
Future-proofing the protocol.
Exactly. Visual aids like diagrams or photos can be helpful too.
Makes things easier to understand.
Right. Don't forget about environmental factors. And lastly, make sure everyone involved knows their stuff and is properly trained.
Thorough training is essential. So what kind of documentation comes out of the IQ process?
Well, you've got the IQ protocol itself, the equipment specifications and manuals, calibration certificates for any equipment used, installation checklists detailing the checks performed.
They're not messing around with that documentation, are they?
Nope. You've also got test and verification records documenting the results of every check.
So it's all there in black and white.
Right. And finally, the final IQ report summarizes everything and provides a conclusion on whether the installation was successful.
A comprehensive record of the entire process. So the design's good, it's been installed properly, now it's time to see if it actually works, right? That brings us to operational qualification, or OQ.
Right. Now we're going to see if this thing actually does what it's supposed to do. We're making sure the equipment operates correctly within the manufacturer specs and the user requirements we discussed earlier.
So IQ is about putting it together right. OQ is about making sure it runs right.
Exactly. OQ is all about testing and documenting that the equipment performs as intended. We need proof that it functions properly.
So how do they go about testing this? What does the OQ process look like?
OQ is pretty structured. It follows a pre-approved protocol detailing all the tests, the parameters to watch, the acceptance criteria, and how data will be collected and analyzed.
So they're really controlling every aspect of the testing to ensure it's accurate and consistent.
Right. Testing happens under various conditions: normal operation, extremes of the operating range, and even worst-case scenarios. It's about pushing the equipment to its limits and finding out where it breaks down.
So stressing the equipment to make sure it can handle real-world situations.
Exactly. And they test every function, mechanical, electrical, software, everything. And of course, they meticulously record all the results and compare them against the acceptance criteria.
I'm noticing a theme here. Detailed documentation is crucial every step of the way.
Absolutely. And just like with IQ, any deviations or weird results have to be investigated, documented, and fixed before they can move on.
So no sweeping problems under the rug.
Right. It's about understanding why something happened and making sure it doesn't happen again.
Okay, can you give us some real-world examples of OQ tests for different types of equipment?
Sure. Imagine an autoclave, which is used for sterilization.
Essential for keeping things germ-free in a pharmaceutical setting.
Exactly. They might do temperature mapping with an empty chamber and a simulated load to ensure even heating throughout the sterilization cycle.
So making sure the temperature is consistent everywhere inside the autoclave.
Right. They'd also test the alarm systems, making sure they go off when they're supposed to. And of course, they'd check the overall sterilization effectiveness.
Making sure it actually kills those germs.
Right. For something like a tablet compression machine, OQ tests might involve checking the tablet weight, hardness, thickness, and disintegration time.
So making sure each tablet is consistent and meets the required specifications.
Exactly. Or take an HPLC system used in a quality control lab. They might do system suitability testing, check retention time precision, and detector linearity.
Lots of technical terms there, but basically making sure the HPLC is working properly and giving accurate results.
Right. And OQ applies to all kinds of systems, like clean rooms, where they check things like airflow and particle counts, or software, where they look at functionality and data security.
Mhm.
Even utility systems like compressed air or purified water undergo OQ to ensure they meet the right quality standards.
So it's not just about the equipment that directly makes the product, it's about the entire environment and all the supporting systems.
Exactly. Everything that can impact the final product quality has to be qualified.
So what do the regulations say about this operational qualification phase?
Well, 21 CFR Part 211.67 for pharmaceuticals specifically mandates proper cleaning, maintenance, and sanitization or sterilization of equipment within its operating parameters. That's on ecfr.gov.
So OQ basically proves that the equipment can be consistently cleaned and sterilized effectively.
Right. Then there's 21 CFR Part 211.68, which requires regular calibration, inspection, and checking of all those automated mechanical and electronic systems.
All things that are carefully checked during OQ.
Exactly. For medical devices, 21 CFR Part 820.70G says that equipment must meet its specified requirements and facilitate maintenance and cleaning. Again, key outcomes of the OQ testing.
It seems like the regulations are really pushing for equipment that is not only functional, but also easy to keep clean and maintain.
Right. And a key part of this is 21 CFR Part 820.75, which specifically identifies OQ as a vital part of ensuring equipment operates correctly within a validated manufacturing process.
So OQ isn't just a nice to have, it's a regulatory requirement for demonstrating that the equipment can be consistently relied upon.
Exactly. And the FDA guidance on process validation on FDA.gov underscores this, emphasizing that OQ is essential for reproducible commercial manufacturing.
So it's all about ensuring consistency and reliability. Now, what about the documentation generated during OQ?
You've got the OQ protocol, of course, laying out the test plan and acceptance criteria. Then you've got the detailed test plans and procedures for each test.
So it's like a recipe book for the tests.
Right. Then there are the test records and data, capturing all the results, and the calibration certificates for any instruments used during OQ.
Again, ensuring everything is traceable and verifiable.
Exactly. And like before, if there are any deviations, they go into deviation reports, along with how they were addressed.
Transparency is key.
Absolutely. And finally, you have the summary report, which gives an overview of the entire OQ process, the key findings, and the final conclusion on whether the equipment passed all the tests.
So it's a thorough package of documentation that provides evidence that the equipment functions as intended. The equipment is designed well, installed correctly, and has passed its operational tests. What's the final stage in this equipment qualification journey?
The last step is performance qualification, or PQ. And this is where we see how the equipment performs in the real world under actual or simulated production conditions.
So if OQ is about proving it can work, PQ is about proving it does work consistently in the real world.
Precisely. PQ is all about verifying and documenting that the equipment, when used in a real production setting, performs consistently as expected, meets all those acceptance criteria, and is truly fit for its intended purpose over time.
So it's a final test, the real-world exam. What are some of the factors that go into designing a PQ and influence its outcome?
Well, those critical process parameters that were identified during process development in OQ are super important. Those are the things that really need to be watched during PQ.
So focusing on the things that have the biggest impact on product quality.
Right. The acceptance criteria, based on the product specs and quality attributes, define what constitutes a pass. And then you got to choose the right performance measurements to evaluate the equipment's output.
So you're carefully selecting what to measure to get a clear picture of how well the equipment is performing.
Exactly. And of course, the documentation requirements for data recording and analysis are crucial, as always. Importantly, the testing has to cover the entire operating range, normal conditions, and those worst-case scenarios, and the frequency and extent of testing needs to be statistically justified.
So you're not just testing it under ideal conditions, you're putting it through the ringer to make sure it can handle anything.
Right. PQ is about mimicking the real world as much as possible.
Can you give us some examples of what a PQ might look like for different equipment?
Sure. Let's say you have a liquid filling machine.
Like for filling bottles of cough syrup or something.
Exactly. A PQ test might involve running the machine with the actual product at various speeds, checking if it consistently fills the bottles to the correct volume.
Making sure every bottle gets the right dose.
Right. For a sterilizer, like an autoclave, PQ would involve running it with actual production-sized batches and making sure it consistently hits those critical sterilization parameters: temperature, pressure, and time.
So it's not just about reaching those parameters in a test run, it's about hitting them consistently when it matters.
Exactly. If you're talking about a complex software system with multiple users, PQ might involve simulating real-world usage with many users logged in simultaneously, doing typical tasks.
Making sure the system doesn't crash when multiple people are using it.
Right. And if data integrity is a concern, PQ would include tests under both normal and stressful conditions.
Hmm.
For a medical device, PQ might involve simulated use testing to ensure it performs as expected under real-world stresses.
So basically putting it through the same wear and tear would experience in a hospital or a patient's home.
Exactly. And they might also evaluate the consistency of a packaging process over multiple runs.
So making sure everything is packaged correctly and consistently every single time. So PQ is really about mimicking real-world use as closely as possible. What about the regulations? Do they have specific requirements for this performance qualification phase?
Absolutely. For pharmaceuticals, there's 21 CFR Part 211.11a, which requires written procedures for production and process control to guarantee product quality. PQ is a big part of proving that this assurance is in place. This can be found on ecfr.gov.
So PQ helps demonstrate that the manufacturing process, including the equipment, is consistently producing high-quality medications.
Exactly. For medical devices, it's 21 CFR Part 820.75a, which requires validation of processes where the product quality can't be fully verified by inspection afterward.
So you can't just check the final product, you need to validate the entire process that led to that product.
Right. And the FDA's guidance on process validation, which often talks about PPQ or process performance qualification, emphasizes the need for scientific evidence that the process consistently delivers quality products. You can find that guidance on fda.gov.
So it's not just about saying, yeah, it works. You need data to back it up. What about the documentation for PQ? Is it similar to the other stages?
Yes, it follows the same pattern. You've got the PQ protocol outlining the objectives, scope, and test procedures. Then the test plans and procedures with those detailed instructions. And, of course, the test records and data capturing all the results from each run.
Meticulous record keeping, as always.
Right. Calibration certificates are essential for any equipment used during testing, and any deviations get logged in the deviation reports along with how they were handled.
Ensuring full transparency and accountability.
Exactly. And finally, you've got the summary report, which provides an overview of the PQ process, the main findings, and conclusions on whether the equipment consistently met the performance standards under real-world conditions.
So we've gone through DQ, IQ, OQ, and PQ. It's pretty clear that these aren't just isolated steps. They're all connected, building on each other, right?
Absolutely. The 4 stages of equipment qualification are interconnected and are designed to be implemented in a specific order. This ensures a robust and thorough approach to equipment qualification.
Can you quickly explain how each stage depends on the one before it?
Sure. It all starts with DQ, making sure the design is solid. A good design is the foundation for everything else. Then IQ comes in to ensure the equipment is physically installed correctly, following that design and the manufacturer's instructions.
So if it's not installed properly, it's not going to operate properly.
Exactly. Next, OQ verifies that the correctly installed equipment actually operates within those specifications. It's about ensuring basic functionality.
So it can perform its intended tasks.
Right. And finally, PQ takes it to the real world, demonstrating that the equipment can consistently perform as expected in a real production environment.
So each stage builds on the previous one, adding another layer of assurance that the equipment is fit for its intended use.
Exactly. And when all 4 stages are successfully completed, you've got strong evidence that the equipment meets all the regulatory requirements and contributes to producing safe, high-quality products.
It's all about building confidence in the equipment's reliability and performance. Okay, understanding these steps is one thing, but what about the practical implementation of EQ? What are some real-world considerations?
Well, a risk-based approach is essential. You've got to identify the most critical equipment, the stuff that really impacts product quality and patient safety, and prioritize those.
So focusing on what matters most.
Right. And risk assessment isn't a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process throughout the entire EQ lifecycle. Right from defining user requirements to assessing design risks, risk assessment helps determine the level of rigor and the scope of your validation efforts.
So always being proactive and anticipating potential problems. What are some good strategies for successful EQ?
First of all, those user requirements, the URS, have to be crystal clear and comprehensive. They're the foundation for everything else. And installation has to be done right, following the design and the manufacturer's guidelines.
Attention to detail is key.
Absolutely. And remember that URS should be the guiding document throughout the entire process. It keeps everyone aligned on what the equipment needs to achieve. Factory acceptance tests, FAT, at the vendor's site, and site acceptance tests, SAT, after installation, can really streamline things and catch problems early.
So testing it thoroughly before it even arrives and then again after it's set up.
Exactly. Careful planning is also crucial for both efficiency and effectiveness. Documentation, of course, is non-negotiable. Everything needs to be recorded.
No shortcuts when it comes to documentation.
Right. And don't forget about ongoing monitoring and maintenance. It's not just about qualifying it once. You need to make sure it stays qualified.
So it's a long-term commitment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And while quality and compliance are paramount, you also need to be mindful of things like cost and project timelines.
Balancing those competing priorities.
Exactly.
Now, what are some of the practical challenges that companies might face during this whole process?
Well, EQ can be expensive, both in terms of the qualification activities themselves and any vendor costs associated with FAT and SAT.
So it's an investment.
It is. And the time it takes to do everything, DQ, IQ, OQ, PQ, can impact project timelines. Good planning is crucial.
Time is money, as they say.
Exactly. And you need thorough testing strategies that cover the entire operating range, maybe even include simulated failure modes to find those breaking points.
So really pushing the equipment to its limit.
Exactly. If the equipment needs to talk to other systems, you need interoperability testing. Environmental factors, things like temperature and humidity, can affect performance.
So considering all the possible variables?
Right. Data integrity is also hugely important, especially these days. And depending on the equipment, you might need to do sequential testing and load testing.
Really making sure it can handle those real-world demands.
Exactly. And last but not least, collaboration between different departments, engineering, QA, production. Everyone needs to be on the same page.
Teamwork makes the dream work.
Absolutely. And of course, companies need to stay up to date on any changes to regulations. The Federal Register is a good source for that.
So staying informed about the latest requirements from the FDA and other regulatory bodies. Okay, we've talked about getting equipment qualified, but how do they make sure it stays qualified over time?
That's a great question. Achieving qualification is just the first step. Maintaining it is an ongoing effort.
So it's not a one-and-done deal. What are some of the things companies need to do to keep their equipment qualified?
Ongoing monitoring and maintenance are essential. This includes regular inspections, calibrations, system checks, preventive maintenance, and a system for quickly dealing with any deviations or issues that pop up.
So staying vigilant and proactive.
Exactly. Reviewing those maintenance records, calibration data, equipment logs can help spot trends or problems before they become major issues.
So it's about being data-driven and using that data to guide your maintenance efforts.
Right.
You also mentioned periodic requalification. What does that involve?
Periodic requalification is basically checking up on the equipment at set intervals to make sure it's still operating within specs and meeting all the requirements.
So it's like a checkup for the equipment.
Exactly. And you might also need to do requalification after major maintenance, modifications, or upgrades. The frequency and depth of requalification should always be based on a risk assessment.
So how often you check up on it depends on how critical the equipment is and how likely it is to have problems.
Exactly.
And finally, you talked about change control. What role does that play in maintaining the qualified state?
Change control is all about managing any changes to the equipment, software, or processes in a controlled way. Any change has to be evaluated, documented, and approved before it's implemented. This includes assessing the potential impact on the equipment's qualified status and deciding if any requalification or additional testing is needed. It's all about making sure changes don't accidentally undermine the qualified state.
So no rogue engineers making changes without going through the proper channels.
Right. Change control is about ensuring that everything is done in a systematic and controlled manner to maintain that qualified state.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the initial design phase all the way through to maintaining equipment in a qualified state. What's the key takeaway for our listeners?
The main takeaway is that equipment qualification, going through those DQ, IQ, OQ, and PQ stages, is absolutely essential in these industries. It's all about guaranteeing the quality of the products, ensuring patient safety, and meeting those strict regulatory requirements.
It's a critical process that underpins the safety and reliability of the healthcare products we depend on.
Exactly. And it's not just a checklist. It's a commitment to quality and safety that extends throughout the entire life cycle of the equipment.
It's a continuous process of monitoring, maintaining, and adapting to ensure those machines continue to perform at the highest level.
Absolutely.
As we wrap up, I want to encourage everyone to think about the intricate web of steps that go into ensuring the quality of those medications and medical devices. It really makes you appreciate the effort and dedication of the people